In the history of modern mixed martial arts, few names are mentioned with near absolute respect like Georges St-Pierre. From a boy growing up in Quebec, he stepped into the world of MMA and gradually built a career that many experts call nearly perfect. St-Pierre became the UFC welterweight champion twice, the man who dominated the division for years with a record 9 successful title defenses, one of the most impressive feats in UFC history. He defeated the most dangerous opponents of his generation, from Matt Hughes, BJ Penn, John Fitch all the way to Nick Diaz and Carlos Condit. And it didn't stop there. After years away from the sport, he returned and beat Michael Bisping to become the UFC middleweight champion, making him one of the rare fighters in the organization's history to win titles in 2 weight classes. St-Pierre's accomplishments earned him induction into the UFC Hall of Fame, multiple Fighter of the Year awards, and recognition from Canadian sports organizations as one of the greatest athletes the country has ever produced. To millions of fans around the world, Georges St-Pierre isn't just a fighter, he's a symbol of discipline, tactical intelligence, and perfection in mixed martial arts. But behind the image of a champion who seemed almost flawless, lies a truth very few people know. For more than 20 years stepping into the octagon, Georges St-Pierre lived 2 parallel lives. One life played out in front of millions of viewers, where he was the undefeated warrior, the man who walked out under the arena lights with a calm face that made opponents doubt themselves. But the other life happened in silence, behind the locker room door and through long sleepless nights. There were no cheers, only a man facing the constant shadow of fear of failure that always followed him. St-Pierre has admitted many times that before every fight, anxiety would appear, like a shadow he could never shake. He would wonder if he was good enough, if this time he would fall in front of the whole world. Yet that very fear became the fuel that drove him to obsessive training and more meticulous preparation than any other fighter. Every training session, every fight, every step in his career was a battle with himself. And perhaps that's why Georges St-Pierre's story isn't just the story of a champion, it's the story of a human being who learned to turn fear into strength to keep standing tall in front of the entire world. If the story of Georges St-Pierre's journey full of inner conflict and resilience makes you curious, please hit subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next part, where we'll go back in time to his painful childhood. But to understand why such a strong man carried such deep fear inside him, we have to go way back, to a small quiet town in Quebec, Canada, where it all began. Saint-Isidore wasn't a famous place, it was just an ordinary community, small snow-covered roads in winter, low houses, and working families living quietly year after year there. On May 19, 1981, Georges St-Pierre was born into a family that wasn't wealthy but full of love. His father, Roland St-Pierre, was a strict but devoted man who worked hard to support the family. His mother, Pauline, was a gentle woman who cared for her children with almost infinite patience. No one in their family could have imagined that the little boy growing up in that simple house would one day become one of the greatest fighters in the world. But George's childhood wasn't the legendary tale people often tell about champions. He wasn't the strongest kid in class, he wasn't the loudest, and he definitely wasn't the one who scared others. George was small, skinny, and especially quiet. He spoke very little, often standing in the corner of the schoolyard, watching rather than joining the noisy games of the other kids. In a school world where strength and confidence usually determined a child's place, Georges quickly became an easy target for bullies. At first it was just teasing, light shoves in the hallway, but then things grew crueler. There were days he got blocked on the way home. Older kids grabbed his backpack, rummaged through it, and took whatever they liked. Some days they pushed him to the ground just to laugh. Georges didn't fight back, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. And deep down he was afraid that if he resisted, things would get even worse. One of the most painful memories from his childhood happened in the school locker room. It was a normal afternoon after classes, but as Georges got ready to change and head home, he discovered everything he owned was gone. Clothes, shoes, all taken by bullies who decided to make him the joke. With nothing to wear, the little boy Georges had to find a way home in the shame and despair no child should ever experience. When he stepped outside, the Quebec cold cut into his skin, but the pain in his heart hurt far worse. It wasn't just humiliation, It was the moment Georges St-Pierre first understood that the world isn't always fair, that sometimes if you're weak, others won't hesitate to take advantage of it. And for a shy boy, realizing that truth could feel like a quiet crack forming in his heart. In the days that followed, Georges often came home with small bruises on his arms or knees, trying to hide them from his parents. But his father Roland was a man who'd been through a lot. He saw the signs Georges thought he'd hidden so well. He saw how his son walked in with his eyes down, saw the long silence at dinner, and he understood that his boy was fighting something he didn't know how to face. For Roland St-Pierre, watching his son get hurt like that was unacceptable. But instead of teaching Georges how to get revenge or fueling anger, he chose a different path, a path that would later completely change the boy's life. He took Georges to a martial arts class. At first it was simply Kyokushin karate, not to turn his son into a warrior, but to teach him two important things: how to defend himself, and how to believe in himself. But even when he stepped into that first dojo, Georges wasn't a strong kid. He was still shy, still scared, and still carrying the wounds the bullies had left. Every punch, every kick he learned wasn't just a martial arts technique. It was like a small step in reclaiming his self-respect. However, the most important thing is that George's fear didn't disappear. It didn't vanish after the first class. It didn't vanish after years of training. In fact, that fear stayed there, quietly living in the heart of the boy who'd been bullied. And the irony is that the very fear that made Georges feel the weakest as a child became the silent drive pushing him to train harder, try harder, and never allow himself to become that helpless boy from the old days again. No one in that small karate class in Quebec back then could have known that the quiet boy standing in the corner would one day step into the biggest arenas in the world. But perhaps what's most important is this: before Georges St-Pierre became a champion, before he became a symbol of strength, he was once a boy who couldn't fight back, and that painful helplessness quietly laid the first brick in the journey to becoming one of the greatest fighters in MMA history. Roland St-Pierre wasn't a man of many words, but he understood his son better than Georges realized. After days of seeing the small bruises on his arms, the heavy steps when the boy came home, and the downcast eyes whenever asked about school, he knew something was hurting his son. Roland wasn't the type of parent who believed kids had to handle everything on their own. He understood that if he didn't help George find his own strength, the boy would grow up carrying weakness and fear for the rest of his life. So one day he took George to a place the boy never thought he'd belong, a small Kyokushin karate class in Quebec. For that shy kid, stepping into the dojo felt like entering a completely different world. The loud ki-is echoing off the walls, the powerful punches, the sharp kicks, everything made George both afraid and curious. In that class he was the smallest, the weakest and the quietest. But karate didn't start with strikes, it started with discipline. George learned to bow before stepping onto the mat, learned to stand straight, learned to focus on his breathing, and little by little, the boy who'd been bullied began to understand that strength didn't just come from muscles, it came from self-control. The early days weren't easy. George often got knocked down during sparring. His kicks were weak, his punches slow, but unlike the schoolyard where he'd been mocked, in the karate dojo, failure wasn't shame, it was part of learning, and every time he got back up after falling, George felt himself changing a little. He started training more, not just during class, but at home too. Karate moves repeated hundreds of times, punches thrown into the air until his arms ached. No one forced him to do it, but inside George there was a quiet drive he couldn't even explain. It was fear. Fear of going back to being that helpless boy in the locker room. Fear of being laughed at. Fear of being hit without being able to fight back. Karate didn't erase that fear. It only changed how George faced it. Instead of running from it, he began turning it into fuel. Every training session became a promise to himself that he would never again be that weak child from before. As George grew older, training stopped being just an after-school activity. It became the center of his life. While other kids played video games or hung out after school, George spent hours in the dojo. He watched the older fighters, learned how they moved, how they kept balance, how they controlled their bodies. New techniques made him feel like he was building an invisible armor around himself. but deep down he was still the boy who'd been hurt, and that very fact drove George to train with an obsession few around him understood. He didn't just want to be stronger, he wanted to be strong enough that no one could ever hurt him again. That was a goal both simple and painful. As the years passed, George's body changed. He grew taller, stronger, faster, but more importantly, his mind changed too. Karate taught him patience, taught him that true strength wasn't in hurting others, but in controlling yourself. Yet the fear in George never fully disappeared. It was like a quiet shadow following every step he took, and instead of chasing it away, George began to accept it. The fear made him train harder. The fear made him prepare more thoroughly. The fear made him never allow himself to get lazy or complacent. In a strange way, fear became the strictest teacher in Georges St-Pierre's life. It reminded him every day that the world could be cruel, that strength had to be built bit by bit, and that no one was allowed to rest on their victories. Looking back on those years, perhaps no one in that small karate class could have imagined that the quiet boy repeating basic moves in the corner would one day step into the biggest arenas of mixed martial arts. But even then, something important was beginning to form. Georges St-Pierre wasn't just learning how to fight, he was learning how to live with his fear, and that, even though he didn't realize it at the time, would become the foundation for everything that came later in his life. The years of karate training changed George in ways the shy boy he once was could never have imagined. His body grew stronger, his reflexes quicker, and most importantly, he began to believe he could defend himself. But along with that growth, a new dream started to take shape. As George got older, the world of martial arts expanded before his eyes. It wasn't just karate anymore. He began watching mixed martial arts fights on television, where fighters from different disciplines stepped into the cage to prove who was the strongest. That was the early era of MMA, when the sport was still raw, not widely accepted, and to many people, it looked more like a dangerous experiment than a real career. But for George, as it felt like an irresistible call, he realized what he'd learned was only a small part of a much larger fighting world, and if he wanted to become truly strong, he had to learn it all. However, the dream of becoming an MMA fighter for a young man in Quebec wasn't an easy path. George wasn't born into a wealthy family. There was no one backing his training with money, no famous coaching team waiting for him to walk into the gym. He had only one thing: willpower. But willpower, no matter how strong, couldn't pay gym rent or buy training equipment. So George started doing whatever he could to keep chasing his dream. By day he trained, by night he worked. At one point George cleaned the gym floors after everyone had left. The sweat-soaked dusty mats were wiped clean by him bit by bit, while his body still ached from the previous session. The job wasn't glamorous, but it let him stay in the one place he most wanted to belong, the gym. On top of that, George worked as a bouncer at nightclubs and bars. That job wasn't easy either. Long nights standing at the door, dealing with arguments and drunk people, sometimes left him exhausted. But the pay from that work helped cover his martial arts fees and buy the gear he needed. When he could, George even taught beginner classes. Small sessions with a few students became a way to earn a little extra money. But deep down he knew he was still very far from his real dream. There were days George trained until his body was nearly spent. After the last session of the day, when everyone had gone home, the gym grew quiet and dark. Sometimes too tired, or without enough money for a better place to stay, George simply lay down right on the gym floor and slept there. Those martial arts mats became his makeshift bed. No stage lights, no audience, no fame, just a young man lying in the gym's darkness, staring at the ceiling and wondering if any of this was worth it. The MMA dream at that time felt like a desperate gamble. No one guaranteed he would succeed. No one said all these years of hardship would lead to anything big. In fact, most people who pursued this path failed. They trained for years, endured injuries, sacrificed their youth, and eventually gave up to find a normal job. George understood that, and sometimes when he was most exhausted, he wondered if he was on the wrong road. But whenever that thought crept in, an old memory came rushing back to his mind. The image of the small boy being bullied in the locker room, the feeling of helplessness when he couldn't do anything to protect himself. And right away, George knew he could never go back to that old life, because for him, Martial arts wasn't just a career, it was the only way to prove he was no longer that weak boy from the past. So George kept moving forward. Day after day, year after year, he learned more disciplines: Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, wrestling, boxing, Muay Thai. Each one opened a new door, making him realize the fighting world was far bigger than he'd ever known. But the more he learned, the more Georges understood that the road ahead was also much harder. Because in MMA, you don't just need strength, you need patience, tactical intelligence, and a spirit that never quits. Those hard years gradually forged George into a different person, no longer the shy boy standing in the corner of the schoolyard, but not yet the champion the world would later know. He was in the middle of a lonely journey, with no cheering crowd, no medals, only quiet persistence and a fragile belief that one day all these sacrifices would mean something. And it was on that lonely road that Georges St-Pierre began taking his first steps closer to his destiny in the world of MMA. The years of grueling work and training to exhaustion finally led Georges to a door he'd been waiting for a very long time. It wasn't a massive arena with tens of thousands of fans or dazzling lights like later on. It was just small mixed martial arts events held in Canada, in modest arenas where the audience sat right up against the cage, and everything still carried the raw breath of early MMA. But for Georges St-Pierre, stepping into the cage for the first time felt like stepping into a dream he'd nurtured for years. When the iron door closed behind him, the outside world almost disappeared. No more gym noise, no more nights scrubbing floors or endless bouncer shifts, just two men standing across from each other and an unavoidable fight. Georges' early fights took place in a very different atmosphere from the UFC that came later. No grand entrance music, no millions watching on television, but for Georges, every fight still carried the weight of the long journey behind it. Every punch, every submission, every movement in the cage was the result of thousands of quiet hours training in that small Quebec gym. What quickly set Georges apart from many other fighters wasn't explosive power but the way he fought. While many opponents relied on aggression or raw strength, Georges fought like someone solving a complex puzzle. Every move was calculated. He moved lightly, observed his opponent, waited for the right moment before launching precise attacks. It was a style both cold and efficient. Spectators sometimes found it hard to understand. He didn't show anger, he didn't yell, he didn't try to excite the crowd with dramatic actions. Georges fought in silence, like a man carrying out a mission he'd prepared for a very long time. Gradually the wins started coming, not lucky wins, but convincing ones. Opponents were controlled on the mat, put into positions they couldn't escape. Precise takedowns, tight submissions, and an astonishing patience for such a young fighter. People began to notice him. In gyms and small MMA events, the name Georges St-Pierre started getting mentioned more often. They talked about a young guy from Quebec with surprisingly smart and disciplined fighting style. But inside Georges, things weren't as simple as the calm appearance people saw in the cage. Before every fight, he still felt that familiar feeling rising in his chest. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't absolute confidence. It was fear. The same feeling as when he was a kid standing in the school hallway, not knowing if someone would block his way. Before stepping into the cage, Georges often sat alone in the locker room. He breathed deeply, trying to calm his racing heart. Outside the crowd was noisy, but in his head the familiar questions started appearing. What if I lose? What if I'm not good enough? What if all these years of training lead only to failure? Those questions didn't disappear even when the fight began. But what set Georges apart was that he didn't let that fear control him. Instead he turned it into focus. Whenever anxiety hit, he concentrated on technique, on distance, on breathing, and little by little, the fear transformed into precision in every movement. Over time, Georges began to understand that fear wasn't the enemy. It was like a warning signal, reminding him that everything in the cage was real. One punch could change the fight. One small mistake could make everything collapse. So he prepared more thoroughly than anyone else, trained harder, studied opponents more deeply, and that very obsession made his fighting style increasingly perfect. But no matter how many wins he got, a part of Georges never changed. because deep down he still remembered very clearly the boy who once stood trembling in the school locker room, the boy who couldn't fight back, the boy who didn't know how to protect himself. And in a strange way, that memory kept Georges from ever allowing himself to become arrogant. Every time he stepped into the cage, he didn't think of himself as a champion. He thought of himself as someone trying to prove he deserved to be there. Those small fights in Canada back then, no one knew where they would lead Georges. No one in the audience sitting around the cage could imagine that the young man fighting before their eyes would one day become one of the greatest fighters in MMA history. But for Georges St-Pierre, that journey had begun, not with glory, not with fame, but with the quiet steps of a young man still fighting his own fear, one fight at a time. The string of consecutive wins in small MMA tournaments in Canada finally brought Georges closer to the dream he'd pursued through all those lonely years of youth. Fight after fight, the name Georges St-Pierre started appearing more often in martial arts conversations. People talked about the young guy from Quebec with an astonishingly disciplined and precise fighting style, and then what he'd once thought was only a distant dream suddenly became reality. The opportunity to step into the UFC finally arrived. For Georges, the UFC wasn't just a league, it was the pinnacle of the MMA world. The place where the planet's best fighters met, where dreams were either realized or crushed. When he entered the organization, he was still a young face with far less experience than many opponents. But Georges didn't step in with the fear he'd felt as a child. He stepped in with the belief that all those years of grueling training had finally brought him to the right place. His first UFC fights happened faster than he expected. And even more astonishingly, he won. Georges defeated dangerous opponents with the smart, cold fighting style that had become his signature. Each victory brought him closer to what every fighter dreams of, a title shot. And then that chance came too. His opponent was one of the most feared men in the welterweight division at the time, Matt Hughes. Hughes wasn't just the champion, he was a UFC legend, a fighter with overwhelming power and vast experience. To many, Georges was just a young challenger who hadn't truly been tested yet. But for Georges, this was the moment he'd waited for all those years. Before the fight, he told the press he was ready, and he believed it. After all the years of training, after all the nights sleeping on the gym floor, after all the sacrifices, how could he not be ready? When he stepped into the cage that day, Georges carried the belief that this could be the night his life changed forever. But MMA, like life, is never as simple as the dreams people draw. The fight started at a fast pace. Georges tried to use his agility and tactics to control the distance, but Matt Hughes was a fighter who'd been through countless battles. He knew how to apply pressure. He knew how to turn the fight into one where he had the advantage. Minute by minute, Georges began to feel the weight of the experience Hughes carried. The takedowns, the powerful control, everything slowly wore down the young fighter's confidence. And then the decisive moment arrived. Hughes locked Georges in a submission he couldn't escape. Georges fought hard, his body tensed, searching for any gap to break free. But Hughes's experience was too great. The pressure of the choke grew stronger. Finally, Georges was forced to tap out. The fight ended. The crowd was still noisy, but for Georges all sound seemed to vanish. He left the cage in silence. No anger, no emotional outburst, just a deep emptiness. Back in the locker room, Georges sat down on a cold metal chair. People around him talked. Some offered comfort, but he barely heard anything. He bowed his head and stared at the floor. It was a long, heavy moment, no tears, no complaints, just silence. In his mind a question began to echo, maybe I'm not good enough. That thought felt like a crack forming in his psyche. All the years of training, all the sacrifices, all the dreams seemed to stand before a cruel question: did he really belong here? For many fighters, a first loss at that high level could destroy a career completely. It could make them doubt themselves so deeply they never recover. And in those silent minutes in the locker room, Georges felt that too, the feeling that the MMA world might be bigger than he'd imagined, that maybe he was just a young man who dreamed too big. But what Georges didn't know at that moment was that this defeat, no matter how painful, would become one of the most important moments in his life. Because sometimes to become a true champion, a person has to go through the moment when they believe they're not good enough. and it was in the darkness of that doubt that true willpower began to form. That night, Georges St-Pierre left the locker room with a heavy heart, but deep inside, though faint, a fire still burned, and over time that fire would turn this painful defeat into the foundation for the greatest comeback in welterweight history. The loss to Matt Hughes wasn't the end of Georges St-Pierre's career. On the contrary, it became a quiet wound that forced him to change. The months after that defeat were a time when Georges trained with an obsession few people understood. He returned to the gym with one single goal: to never let that feeling of helplessness happen again. Every training session grew more brutal. Georges studied opponents more deeply, improved his wrestling, perfected his jiu-jitsu, and pushed his conditioning to the point of near exhaustion, and then that effort began to pay off. Georges came back stronger. He defeated formidable opponents and finally achieved what he'd once dreamed of, reclaiming the UFC welterweight title. In the eyes of fans, Georges St-Pierre's story at that point looked like a perfect journey. A young man who'd failed, but returned and conquered the peak. He was seen as the most complete fighter of his generation. Commentators praised his tactical intelligence, discipline, and calm in the cage. And then in 27, a fight was arranged that almost no one thought would change history. Georges' opponent was Matt Serra. Serra entered the fight as an unexpected challenger after winning on the reality show The Ultimate Fighter. Compared to Georges, Serra was smaller, less famous, and almost no one believed he could do anything special. Before the fight, most experts made the same prediction: Georges St-Pierre would win easily. Some even said the fight was just another stepping stone in the champion's dominance. Georges also entered the fight with confidence. Not arrogance, but belief built from thousands of hours of training. But MMA is a sport where a single moment can change everything. When the fight began, Georges tried to control the distance like he always did. But just a few minutes in, something no one expected started happening. Serra rushed in with speed and aggression that caught Georges off guard. A punch landed clean, then another. Georges tried to stay balanced, but Serra gave him no chance. The punches came faster and heavier. The arena began to descend into chaos. The crowd was no longer sure what they were witnessing. Georges, the champion everyone thought was nearly perfect, was being overwhelmed. Another punch rocked him off balance. Serra kept attacking relentlessly. The referee watched closely, and then the moment no one in the arena could ever forget happened. Georges St-Pierre went down. The referee was forced to stop the fight. Matt Serra had knocked out the champion. For a few seconds, the arena fell into a strange silence, not because the crowd didn't know how to react, but because they were trying to understand what had just happened. It was one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. The man the whole world believed would win easily had just been defeated in a way no one could have imagined. Georges rose slowly. His eyes no longer held that sharp focus from before. There was no rage, no protest, just an empty stare, as if part of him had been taken away. As he left the cage, he walked in silence. The cheers and voices around him seemed unable to reach him. To the audience it was just a shocking fight, but to Georges, it was a far deeper shock. In the locker room after the fight, the air was so heavy it was hard to breathe. Georges sat down on a chair, head bowed, sweat and blood still on his face. But what hurt him most wasn't the physical wounds. It was the feeling that everything he'd built might have just crumbled in a few minutes. In his mind, the questions started returning. Am I really worthy of being champion? Did everyone who believed in me make a mistake? And deeper still was the fear he'd carried since childhood. The fear that one day people would realize he wasn't as strong as they thought. That night, Georges St-Pierre felt himself breaking. Not because he'd been knocked out, but because for the first time since becoming champion, he looked in the mirror and wasn't sure who he was anymore. But what the world didn't yet know was that sometimes the darkest nights create the deepest changes in a person. And in the darkness of that defeat, a quiet decision began to form inside Georges. Either he would let this loss define him, or he would come back and rewrite his entire story. The loss to Matt Serra didn't mark the end of Georges St-Pierre's career. On the contrary, it became a quiet wound that forced him to change. The weeks after that defeat were a time when Georges trained with an obsession few people understood. He returned to the gym with one single goal: to never let that feeling of helplessness happen again. Every training session grew more brutal. Georges studied opponents more deeply, improved his wrestling, perfected his jiu-jitsu, and pushed his conditioning to the point of near exhaustion. And then that effort began to pay off. Georges came back stronger. He defeated formidable opponents, and finally achieved what he'd once dreamed of: reclaiming the UFC welterweight title. In the eyes of fans, Georges St-Pierre's story at that point looked like a perfect journey. A young man who'd failed, but returned and conquered the peak. He was seen as the most complete fighter of his generation. Commentators praised his tactical intelligence, discipline, and calm in the cage. And then in 27, a fight was arranged that almost no one thought would change history. Georges' opponent was Matt Serra. Serra entered the fight as an unexpected challenger after winning on the reality show The Ultimate Fighter. Compared to Georges, Serra was smaller, less famous, and almost no one believed he could do anything special. Before the fight, most experts made the same prediction: Georges St-Pierre would win easily. Some even said the fight was just another stepping stone in the champion's dominance. Georges also entered the fight with confidence, not arrogance, but belief built from thousands of hours of training. But MMA is a sport where a single moment can change everything. When the fight began, Georges tried to control the distance like he always did. But just a few minutes in, something no one expected started happening. Serra rushed in with speed and aggression that caught Georges off guard. A punch landed clean, then another. Georges tried to stay balanced, but Serra gave him no chance. The punches came faster and heavier. The arena began to descend into chaos. The crowd was no longer sure what they were witnessing. Georges, the champion everyone thought was nearly perfect, was being overwhelmed. Another punch rocked him off balance. Serra kept attacking relentlessly. The referee watched closely, and then the moment no one in the arena could ever forget happened. Georges St-Pierre went down. The referee was forced to stop the fight. Matt Serra had knocked out the champion. For a few seconds, the arena fell into a strange silence, not because the crowd didn't know how to react, but because they were trying to understand what had just happened. It was one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. The man the whole world believed would win easily had just been defeated in a way no one could have imagined. Georges rose slowly. His eyes no longer held that sharp focus from before. There was no rage, no protest, just an empty stare, as if part of him had been taken away. As he left the cage, he walked in silence. The cheers and voices around him seemed unable to reach him. To the audience, it was just a shocking fight, but to Georges, it was a far deeper shock. In the locker room after the fight, the air was so heavy it was hard to breathe. Georges sat down on a chair, head bowed, sweat and blood still on his face. But what hurt him most wasn't the physical wounds. It was the feeling that everything he'd built might have just crumbled in a few minutes. In his mind, the questions started returning. Am I really worthy of being champion? Did everyone who believed in me make a mistake? And deeper still was the fear he'd carried since childhood. The fear that one day people would realize he wasn't as strong as they thought. That night Georges St-Pierre felt himself breaking. Not because he'd been knocked out, but because for the first time since becoming champion, he looked in the mirror and wasn't sure who he was anymore. But what the world didn't yet know was that sometimes the darkest nights create the deepest changes in a person. And in the darkness of that defeat, a quiet decision began to form inside Georges. Either he would let this loss define him, or he would come back and rewrite his entire story. The years of rebuilding himself after the loss to Matt Serra were neither easy nor quick. But day by day, the changes Georges St-Pierre made began to yield results. He was no longer the fighter who relied solely on instinct and physicality like before. He became a strategist in the octagon, a man who analyzed fights with near-scientific precision. When Georges returned to competition, the MMA world started to realize they were witnessing a completely different version of him. A calmer, more disciplined version that left almost no openings for opponents to exploit. After avenging Matt Serra and reclaiming the welterweight title, Georges entered a period that many later called one of the most impressive dominant runs in UFC history. But what made Georges' dominance special wasn't explosive knockouts or chaotic wins. It was control. In every fight he seemed to dictate the entire pace of the battle. Opponents stepped into the cage hoping for an upset, but minute by minute they gradually realized they were being drawn into a tactical system Georges had prepared for a very long time. One of the first notable opponents in that dominant phase was B.J. Penn. Penn was a martial arts genius, a fighter with world-class jiu-jitsu and near-limitless confidence. Before the fight, many believed Penn could be the one to beat Georges. But when the fight unfolded, the audience began to see something else. Georges used wrestling to control Penn, putting the fight into positions where he held the advantage. Round after round, Penn gradually wore down under constant pressure. Finally, Penn's corner was forced to stop the fight. Georges St-Pierre won again, and the welterweight title stayed with him. But that was just one chapter in his long chain of victories. Next came the fight with John Fitch. Fitch was then one of the most dangerous fighters in the division, with a long win streak and an extremely durable wrestling style. Many thought Fitch would pose major problems for the champion, but Georges proved otherwise. He controlled the fight from start to finish, using precise takedowns, sharp punches and superior movement to completely dominate his opponent. It wasn't just a win, it was a performance that forced the entire MMA world to admit Georges St-Pierre was on another level. The dominant streak continued against other dangerous opponents. In the fight with Josh Koscheck, Georges showed how far his striking had progressed. Koscheck was known for his powerful wrestling, but in that fight, Georges used constant jabs to control distance and damage his opponent. Each jab landed like a small hammer, repeated until Koscheck's face swelled severely. It was a perfectly tactical victory. Then came the fight with Nick Diaz, one of the strongest personalities in MMA history. Diaz entered with his provocative style and confidence that he could break Georges' game plan. But when the octagon door closed, the familiar script played out again. Georges controlled the fight with wrestling and tactics, preventing Diaz from unleashing his pressure style. When the fight ended, Georges won once more by judges' decision. From the outside, this period in Georges St-Pierre's career looked like a perfect era. He defended the title multiple times in a row, defeated the top welterweights, and built a reputation as one of the most complete fighters to ever step into the UFC. Commentators began calling him the perfect MMA fighter. Fans saw him as a symbol of discipline and tactical intelligence. But behind all those victories was a secret very few people knew. Before every fight, Georges couldn't sleep. The night before stepping into the octagon, while most of the MMA world was predicting his win, Georges often lay awake in his hotel room. The room dark and quiet, only faint light from the window. He stared at the ceiling and thought, not about tactics, not about punches or takedowns, but about fear. The fear of failure, the fear that everything could collapse in a single moment. He has said in many interviews that the feeling never went away. Even as champion, even after defeating so many dangerous opponents, the anxiety before every fight was always there. It was like a shadow that followed him throughout his career. Ironically, that very fear became part of Georges' strength, because it made him prepare more thoroughly than anyone else. It made him never underestimate an opponent. It made him train with near-ruthless discipline toward himself. While fans saw a dominant champion, Georges saw a battle he had to win every time he stepped into the cage. And so each victory wasn't a moment of celebration. It was a temporary relief, a brief exhale that lasted only until the next fight was announced. Then the cycle began again, once more, once more, once more. And over time, Georges St-Pierre didn't just become the welterweight champion, he became one of the most dominant fighters the UFC had ever seen. But deep inside, behind all those victories, there remained a truth very few understood. That great champion was still fighting the same enemy he'd known since he was a boy in Quebec, the fear of failure. From the outside, Georges St-Pierre's story seemed perfect. A dominant UFC welterweight champion for years, defeating the most dangerous opponents of his generation and building a reputation as one of the most complete fighters in MMA history. The media called him a model of discipline and professionalism. Fans saw a warrior who appeared almost flawless, an athlete who stepped into the octagon with astonishing calm. But behind that flawless image existed a truth very few people knew. For most of his career, Georges St-Pierre lived like a man with two parallel lives. The first life was the one the world saw. That was Georges St-Pierre of the arena lights, of the big fights, of the championship belts and press conferences. In that life, he was a symbol of strength and control. When he stepped into the cage, he moved with near-cold precision. No visible emotion, no hint of hesitation. Takedowns, jabs, tactics executed as if everything had been programmed in advance. To millions of fans, Georges seemed like a perfect fighting machine. But there was another life running parallel to all of that. A life that took place in silence, when the lights went out and the audience had left the arena. In that life, Georges wasn't the champion. He was just a man trying to find peace in a world that was too loud. Georges was always a very private person. Unlike many famous fighters, he didn't enjoy media attention. He rarely appeared at big parties or glamorous events. When not competing, he lived a simple and quiet life. Instead of chasing the spotlight, he spent time reading, training, or simply being alone. Georges' friends once said he was one of the quietest people in the gym. Not because he was arrogant, but because he always thought a lot. While many other fighters enjoyed fame and attention, Georges often felt out of place in that world. He understood that fame could come and go quickly, and he never felt completely comfortable with being a celebrity. Loneliness sometimes became part of his life. When you're the champion of a global sport, it's hard to know who really understands you. Many people want to be close to you, because of the fame, the opportunities, the benefits that come with knowing a UFC star. But Georges always kept a very small circle of people he truly trusted. In a rare interview, Georges once said something that surprised many people. He admitted that before every fight, he always felt afraid. "I always get scared before stepping into the cage," he said. That wasn't false modesty or a symbolic statement. It was the truth. The fear never went away, even after he became champion and defeated so many dangerous opponents. Before every fight, that feeling still returned. His heart beat faster, his mind filled with questions. What if I fail this time? What if everything I've built collapses in just a few minutes? Those thoughts often came at night, when Georges lay alone in his hotel room before a fight. While the MMA world was predicting his victory, he had to battle an invisible enemy inside his own mind. And that was the biggest secret in Georges St-Pierre's career. He wasn't a fighter who didn't know fear. He was a fighter who learned how to fight, even though he was still afraid. For many years, Georges rarely spoke about it. In the world of martial arts, fear is often seen as a sign of weakness. A champion is expected to be confident, strong, invincible. So Georges kept that secret to himself. In public, he remained the perfect champion. But when alone, he was an ordinary man, with worries and doubts just like anyone else. In a strange way, that very contradiction shaped who Georges St-Pierre was. The life under the lights and the life in silence. The invincible champion and the man who always feared failure. Two lives existing side by side, never fully merging into one. And throughout more than 20 years of competing, Georges learned how to live with both. He stepped into the cage like a warrior. But inside he was still the boy who once stood trembling in a Quebec school hallway. The only difference now was that he no longer ran from that fear. He walked straight into it. After many years of consecutive victories, the MMA world began to view Georges St-Pierre as something almost unbeatable. Every time he stepped into the octagon, fans believed they were witnessing a perfect champion. Fights were analyzed before they even happened, and most predictions were the same. Georges would win. Opponents might be dangerous, might be powerful, but in the end they would be drawn into the tactical system he had built. But what few people understood was that when you reach the peak of a brutal sport like MMA, the pressure doesn't decrease. It increases with every fight. For Georges, becoming champion didn't bring the sense of freedom many imagined. Instead, it created an invisible burden he had to carry every day. When he stepped outside, people recognized him. At airports, restaurants, gyms, there were always eyes following him. Fans wanted photos, Reporters wanted interviews. Strangers wanted to shake hands with the champion. At first, that could make an athlete feel proud, but over time Georges began to realize that fame came with a very high price. He could no longer live a normal life like before. Simple moments like walking through the city, sitting quietly in a coffee shop, or training in peace gradually became rare. Wherever he appeared, attention followed, and with that attention came expectations. People no longer saw Georges St-Pierre as just a person, they saw him as a symbol, a champion who wasn't allowed to show weakness, a fighter who wasn't allowed to fail. That pressure slowly began to build up. Every time a new fight was announced, the familiar cycle started again. Press conferences, interviews, television breakdowns. People talked about tactics, about strength, about what Georges would do to his opponent. But no one really talked about what Georges was facing inside his own mind. Because when you're the champion, failure is no longer just a loss, it becomes a collapse. Georges understood that better than anyone. He knew that every time he stepped into the cage, it wasn't just an opponent waiting for him. It was his reputation, his career, and the expectations of millions of fans. Over time, the stress began to affect him more. Training sessions still happened with the same brutal intensity as before. But inside, Georges started to feel tired in a different way. Not the fatigue of muscles, but the fatigue of the mind. There were days he woke up feeling like he was running in a circle with no end. Train, fight, win, then start all over again. No breaks, no space to breathe. And the irony was that the more he won, the greater the pressure became. Because when you've become the best, people no longer ask if you can win, they only ask how much longer you'll keep winning. Those around him began to notice that Georges was changing. He still trained hard, still stayed professional, but sometimes in rare moments, you could see the exhaustion in his eyes. He started thinking more about life outside the cage, about how much longer he could keep living under this pressure, about whether fame and the championship belt really brought happiness. For many years, Georges had chased perfection. He wanted to be the best fighter, the most prepared, the most disciplined. But when you try to become perfect in a violent sport like MMA, the price you pay is often greater than you imagine. And Georges began to feel that price. The exhaustion slowly appeared, not just in the body, but in the mind. There were times he felt like he was standing at the peak of the MMA world, but didn't know where he was going anymore. The UFC welterweight champion, admired by millions of fans, began to feel something very few could imagine. He felt trapped inside the very image the world had created for him, trapped in the fame of a champion who wasn't allowed to show weakness. And the longer he stood at the top, the more Georges understood that sometimes that position could become an invisible cage, a cage not made of steel like in the arena, but built from expectations, pressure, and the perfection everyone believed he had to maintain. And it was during that time that a thought began to emerge in Georges St-Pierre's mind. A thought many fans weren't ready to hear. Maybe it was time to step out of that cage. The pressure Georges St-Pierre carried for so many years finally led him to one of the hardest decisions of his life. From the fans' perspective, everything still seemed perfect. Georges was still the UFC welterweight champion. He was still defeating the division's top contenders. He was still stepping into the octagon with that familiar calm demeanor. But deep inside, the exhaustion he'd felt for a long time began to weigh heavier than ever. In 2013, Georges entered one of the toughest fights of his career. His opponent this time was Johnny Hendricks, a fighter famous for his terrifying knockout power. Before the fight, many predicted this would be the biggest challenge the champion had faced in years. Hendricks had power, aggression, and a fighting style that could create serious problems for Georges. When the fight started, everything quickly turned into a brutal war. Hendricks attacked aggressively from the very first minutes. His heavy punches forced Georges back multiple times. This wasn't a fight the champion could easily control like before. For the first time in a long while, Georges had to fight not just against his opponent, but against the accumulated fatigue in his body and mind. 5 rounds passed like a storm. The audience in the arena stood watching every moment. Both fighters took heavy damage. Georges still used his familiar tactics, movement, takedowns, controlling the fight's pace, but Hendricks kept applying relentless pressure. When the final bell rang, both men were exhausted. When the result was announced, the judges awarded the win to Georges St-Pierre by decision. The champion kept his belt, but instead of celebrating, Georges stood in the cage with a heavy expression. He knew this fight was different from all the ones before. His body hurt more, his mind felt more tired, and deep down he understood he couldn't keep living in this cycle of pressure forever. At the post-fight press conference, everyone expected Georges to talk about his victory, but the words he spoke stunned the entire MMA world. Georges announced that he was leaving the UFC, not because he'd been defeated, not because he'd lost the belt, but because he needed time away from the sport that had consumed his entire life. The news spread fast across the MMA world. Commentators, fans, and other fighters were shocked. A champion at the peak of his career deciding to walk away. Many didn't understand why, but for Georges, the decision wasn't impulsive. It was the result of years living under enormous pressure. He knew that if he continued, the price he might pay could be far greater. During his dominant years in the UFC, Georges had sacrificed so much: time, privacy, peace of mind. His life revolved around preparing for the next fight, always having to be strong, always having to be perfect. But no one can live like that forever. In a later interview, Georges admitted he needed to stop before things got worse. He felt he was standing on a dangerous edge, where the pressure of his career could start destroying the real person inside him. He said that if he kept competing in that state, he might lose himself completely. For a fighter who'd spent his whole life proving his strength, that admission wasn't easy. But sometimes the most courageous decision isn't to keep fighting, it's to know when to stop. After leaving the UFC, Georges entered a quieter phase of life. No more daily grueling training sessions, no more fights watched by the whole world, no more sleepless nights before stepping into the octagon. For the first time in many years, he had time to breathe. But Georges St-Pierre's departure wasn't like a permanent goodbye. It was more like a pause in a long piece of music, because deep down, part of him still belonged to the octagon. And though he left the UFC in 2013, Georges St-Pierre's story wasn't over. No one knew then that a few years later, the champion who'd stepped away from the spotlight would return, and when he did, the MMA world would witness one of the most memorable comebacks in the sport's history. The years after leaving the UFC in 2013 were a rare time in Georges St-Pierre's life when he didn't have to live by the brutal schedule of a world champion. No more months-long training camps, no more sessions that left his body exhausted, and no more pressure of stepping into the octagon in front of millions. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Georges could wake up in the morning without thinking about the next fight. He spent time reading books, studying philosophy, traveling, and exploring things his fighting schedule had never allowed before. Life became quieter, slower, but even though he'd stepped away from the ring, a part of Georges never fully left the world of MMA. In many interviews, he often said that leaving the UFC was necessary to save himself. The pressure he'd carried for so many years had worn down his mind and body, but as time passed, the sense of disorientation he'd once feared gradually faded. The peace helped Georges look back at his career with a different perspective. He no longer saw MMA only as a cycle of pressure. He began to miss the feeling of stepping into the cage, the absolute focus in those fighting moments, the sensation of pushing himself to the absolute limits of strength and will. And then in 2017, a thought many fans had hoped for but didn't dare believe started becoming clear. Georges St-Pierre wanted to return, but this return was unlike anything before. He wasn't coming back to continue defending the welterweight title. He wanted to challenge himself in a completely new way. Georges decided to fight in a higher weight class, middleweight, to face the champion at the time, Michael Bisping. To many people, the decision was both bold and dangerous. Georges had been away from the cage for years. He was also moving up to a heavier division, where opponents typically had superior size and power. Many analysts called it a huge risk, but for Georges, the decision wasn't reckless. It felt like the final chapter he wanted to write for his own story. When the fight was announced, the MMA world once again turned its eyes to him, not as a dominant champion, but as a legend returning after years away. The months of preparation for the Bisping fight brought Georges back to the intense training he once knew. Brutal camps returned, hours-long wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and striking sessions. But this time he wasn't the young man from the early days of his careers. His body had been through many years of fighting, and every training session reminded him that time never stands still. When fight night finally arrived, the arena once again filled with those familiar cheers. Georges stepped into the octagon after years of absence, but if you looked closely at his face, you could still see the focus he'd carried during his peak years. The fight with Michael Bisping wasn't easy. Bisping was a tough, experienced champion who wasn't easy to beat, but round after round, Georges showed that the years away hadn't dulled his fighting instinct. He used his familiar tactics, controlling distance, taking the opponent down, and waiting for the right moment. And then that moment came. Georges executed a precise attack, putting Bisping in a tight submission hold. Within seconds the middleweight champion was forced to tap out. The arena erupted. After years away from the UFC, Georges St-Pierre returned, and won. Not just won, he became a two-division champion, one of the rarest achievements in UFC history. It was an almost perfect moment for a comeback. The crowd roared, the media praised it, and many called it one of the greatest returns in MMA history. But behind that victory moment, another truth began to emerge. After the fight, Georges admitted that his body no longer responded like it used to. Old injuries started coming back, recovery after training sessions took longer, and even in victory, he clearly felt his body sending warning signals. For many years, Georges St-Pierre had learned how to fight his fear of failure, but now, he had to face a different enemy time, and though the win over Michael Bisping gave him a second title in his career, Georges understood that the final chapter of his story was drawing closer than ever. Not long after the victory over Georges St-Pierre, the MMA world began to realize that the final chapter of his career was slowly coming to a close. The middleweight title he won against Michael Bisping was a rare achievement, proof that even after years away from the cage, Georges could still return and conquer the peak. But inside, he understood that time had started to speak its own language. Old injuries no longer healed as quickly. Heavy training sessions required more days for recovery. And after thinking long and hard, Georges finally made the decision many fans had feared, but somehow understood. He officially retired. There were no loud farewells, no dramatic statements. Just as he had lived most of his life, Georges left the spotlight in calm silence. For fans, one of the greatest fighters in MMA history, stepping away from the ring was a sad moment. But for Georges, it felt like a gentle release. After years of living under the pressure of fame and brutal fights, he could finally return to the simple life he had always wanted. Georges' life after retirement didn't look like what many imagined for a sports legend. He didn't chase lavish parties or noisy TV shows. No scandals, no drama. Instead, Georges chose a quieter rhythm. He continued training every day, but no longer the grueling sessions preparing for fights. Training now felt like a natural part of life, a way to keep his body healthy and his mind balanced. Georges spent much more time on things he could only do in the rare breaks between fights before. He read books, a lot of books, from ancient philosophy, psychology, to science and history. In those pages, Georges found questions and answers he had never had time to consider before. Life no longer revolved around defeating an opponent. It became a journey of understanding himself more deeply. Along with reading, Georges still maintained his martial arts training habit. Not to compete, but because martial arts had become an inseparable part of who he was. In the gym, he sometimes helped young fighters, sharing knowledge about tactics, discipline, and how to control fear. For them, training with Georges St-Pierre felt like learning directly from a living MMA legend. But even though life had become quieter, Georges' past in the MMA world never truly left him. Old fights still got replayed on television. Fans still talked about his wins as classic UFC moments. And wherever he appeared, people still recognized the champion who once dominated welterweight for years. Sometimes Georges looked back on those moments too, not with regret, but with reflection. He remembered the sleepless nights before fights, He remembered the feeling of stepping into the octagon with his heart pounding in his chest. He remembered the tension and pressure the world never saw. But now, those memories felt like old chapters in a book he'd already finished reading. They were still there, still part of the story, but they no longer controlled his present life. Perhaps what surprised many most was that Georges St-Pierre, after retirement, seemed even calmer than when he was competing. No more battles in the octagon, yet he still carried the discipline and humility that defined his entire career. To the MMA world, he will always be one of the greatest champions, but for Georges that title was no longer the most important thing. What mattered more was the peace he had finally found after years of fighting, a peace that came in silence, when the arena lights had gone out, when the crowd's cheers had faded into the distance, and when the man who once stepped into the cage with fear in his heart could finally live the life he had always wanted. Looking back at Georges St-Pierre's entire journey, many people often try to search for some secret behind his success. In the world of sports, it's common to believe that great champions must carry a dramatic story, some dark corner, or a mysterious motivation that turned them into unbeatable warriors. But with Georges St-Pierre, the truth is far simpler and far more profound. Throughout many years, fans often said he lived two lives. One life the whole world saw, the UFC champion, the man who stepped into the octagon with cold precision, the fighter who defeated the most dangerous opponents of his generation and defended the welterweight title multiple times in a row. In that life, George seemed almost perfect. He wasn't the strongest fighter in raw power, but he was one of the most complete fighters ever to appear in MMA, rock-solid wrestling, intelligent jiu-jitsu, precise striking, and a tactical intelligence that made many opponents feel like they were fighting an unsolvable puzzle. But George's second life played out in silence. No cameras, no crowd cheers, no arena lights. In that life, Georges wasn't the champion. He was just an ordinary man with worries and questions anyone could understand. The night before every fight, while the MMA world predicted his victory, Georges often lay awake in his hotel room. His mind didn't think about punches or tactics. It thought about the possibility of failure. What if I lose tomorrow? What if everything I've built collapses in just a few minutes? Those weren't the thoughts of an invincible man. They were the thoughts of a human being who clearly understood that any fight could change everything. And it was that very awareness that made Georges a different fighter. Many champions in sports history tried to hide their fear. They built an image of never doubting themselves. But over time, Georges St-Pierre gradually spoke about that truth more openly. He admitted that fear always existed, not just when he was young, not just after failures, even at the peak of the UFC, when the whole world saw him as the perfect fighter, the fear was still there. But what made Georges different wasn't that he felt fear. What made him different was how he faced that fear. Instead of running from it, he turned it into fuel. Every time worry appeared, Georges trained harder. Every time he doubted himself, he prepared more thoroughly. He studied opponents, refined techniques, and trained his mind. In a strange way, fear became the strictest teacher in his career. It reminded him that no victory was guaranteed, and because of that, he never allowed himself to become lazy or complacent. When looking back at Georges St-Pierre's career, people can see many victories, fights against great opponents, championship belts, records very few fighters could achieve. But behind all those moments were thousands of quiet training hours, sleepless nights before fights, and silent battles in his mind that no one but him could see. That was the double life many people once talked about, not a dark secret, not a hidden existence, just two sides of the same person. One side was the invincible champion in the world's eyes. The other side was a man always aware he could fail at any moment. And that very contradiction shaped who Georges St-Pierre was. Without the fear of the boy who was once bullied in Quebec, Georges might never have stepped into that karate dojo. Without the fear of failure after the loss to Matt Serra, he might never have changed his training and his way of thinking about fighting. And without the fear of losing himself, he might never have left the UFC in 2013 to protect the peace in his mind. Over time, many fighters came and went in the MMA world. New champions emerged. Records were broken. But Georges St-Pierre's story is still retold as one of the most special journeys in the sport. not just because of the wins in the octagon, but because of the honesty and how he faced himself. Today, as Georges lives a quiet life after retirement, he no longer has to step into the cage. No more battles in front of millions, but the legacy he left remains, not just in old fight videos, but in how fans understand strength. Because Georges St-Pierre's story reminds us of something very simple, yet very important. Strength isn't the absence of fear. Strength is knowing fear always exists, and still moving forward, stepping into the fight, stepping into the challenge, stepping into the most important moments of life, even when your heart is trembling. The story of Georges St-Pierre inspires not only admiration, but also a very deep sense of pity, because behind the image of an almost perfect champion in the octagon is a human being who had to carry fear throughout his entire life. When we look back at the details of his journey, from the small boy in Saint Isidore, who was bullied, had his clothes taken in school, and had to quietly walk home in shame, to the man sitting alone in the locker room after the loss to Matt Serra with an empty stare, we realize that George's greatness wasn't built on absolute confidence, but on the moments of weakness he was forced to overcome. The most admirable thing in the story isn't the UFC championship belts, or the victories over opponents like BJ Penn or Johnny Hendricks, but the way he confronted his own fear. Even after becoming the dominant UFC champion, Georges still admitted that he often couldn't sleep before every fight, because he feared failure, and it was that very fear that drove him to train obsessively, study psychology, meditate, and relentlessly improve himself. For Americans, a society that always celebrates winners, Georges St-Pierre's story carries a deeply thought-provoking lesson. True strength isn't never feeling fear, but daring to step into the challenge, even when your heart is still trembling. In a world full of competition, from sports and business to personal life, so many people feel pressured to appear strong. But George's journey reminds us that the greatest people have also doubted themselves at times. And sometimes, what makes a person a legend isn't perfection, but the ability to stand up after moments of breaking and keep moving forward. If the story of Georges St-Pierre's journey, full of fear, but also full of resilience, makes you reflect, please hit subscribe to the channel, and leave a heart emoji as a way to honor the warrior who dared to step into the octagon, even though his heart was always trembling. Thank you for listening to this story, and see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring the great lives hidden behind the spotlight of sports and fame.